Hello and welcome to another episode of Two Nobodies. It is I, Kyle, the lesser, dumber of the two nobodies, less attractive of the two nobodies, taller of the two nobodies, for sure. Yeah. And, as always, the one constant in all these episodes, the one thing you can always count on is the foremost nobody, Rupesh, is going to be here. Rupesh, buddy, how you doing?
Pretty good. I don't want to miss an episode. Like, I feel like I'm on a streak now. And
you've been. If we have, and we don't know what number episode this is. We were just talking about it. Let's say it's 37. I don't know. But you've been in all of them, and you've been, and for probably 20 of those, it's just you. Probably more than that. Well, I'm not sure, but it's been just you. So you're sort of the patriarch of this, if you will. Certainly a pillar in the Two Nobodies podcast community.
Out of the two pillars, I'm one of the pillars.
Yeah, I just leave and you just have to figure out how that works. But yeah, no, you'd have to, if we do 100 episodes, you got to be in all of them. Yeah, I don't know how we would proceed otherwise. It would let the millions of people watching at home down if Rupesh wasn't part of an episode.
If my sultry voice wasn't on the recording.
Yeah, you got a little bit of smolder. You got a little bit of smolder in that voice. And
I've been working on that. The sweater. I've been working.
The sweater's working.
The sweater, yeah. No, I got this for Christmas. Good. It feels really good. It feels like it fits the voice.
What do you mean you've been working on it?
I've been working on voice outside of the podcast, you know.
How?
I haven't actually been doing
Me. Unique New York. I honestly, you can tell, like, people, like, there are some people who just have the most wonderful voices, like David Attenborough, you know, but even guys like Morgan Freeman or Paul Newman, man. So my son's super into the Cars movies. Cars 1 and 3. I don't know what they were doing with Cars 2. That movie is insane. But 1 and 3, good. Paul Newman's in the first one. He passed away after they filmed the first one. He has got a voice like that. Like, if I could have like an old man voice, everybody check out Cars 1. If you're not up on your Pixar animated films, you know, early 2000s, it's like a 2006 movie about a race car, Lightning McQueen, super selfish, doesn't need his pit crew. One day he gets lost, finds himself in a small town, learns about friendship. And Paul Newman's part of that. And Paul Newman has a great voice. So I don't know if I just need to, like, drink and smoke cigarettes and live a bit of a hard life here, and then I'll have just a dynamite voice. But I would love to have one of those sort of smoldering old man voices.
Is that the voice you think that you would, if you could rejig your vocal cords to have a voice, would that be the voice?
Maybe. James Earl Jones has a great voice. Morgan Freeman has a wonderful voice.
I love Sean Connery's voice.
Sean Connery's good too. Yeah, he's got, but it's got that Scottish accent.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Rock. Remember that movie? That movie
that's pretty
so
good. That's one of my favorite. That's one of my favorite action movies, actually.
The best scene in that movie is when they have the like missile and they like take out all the super poisonous balls, like the super, and it's like one of the final fight scenes, and Nicolas Cage is just getting his ass kicked, and he like reaches over and grabs one of the super poisonous balls and puts it in the guy's mouth and punches him. Yeah, and then he's got to do like he has to like do
the needle into his
injections
heart,
like right into his heart. So sick. God, like 15-year-old me, I was like, this is the great. Like, how is this not sweeping the Oscars? This is the greatest movie of all time.
I probably watched that movie like 10, 12 times. Love that movie.
Oh, it's so good. I would like. Have you watched it recently? Like, does it hold up?
I haven't watched probably in like 6, 7 years, but I think I would still love it.
Yeah, I haven't watched it for probably 20 years. But I should probably watch it again because I remember loving it. But I'm also worried. I remember I watched the live action Ninja Turtles movie when I was a kid. I was like 7, and like Ninja Turtles was my world. And I watched that movie and I was like, this is amazing cinema. I watched it again like 5 years ago. That movie is awful. It is really, really bad. So I sort of wish I hadn't watched it again. I just sort of could have held it in high regard for for all time.
Did you see the
Anyways,
live action Disney ones, like for example, Lion King and Aladdin recently?
no, why would I? Like the animated are so good. Like the animated are perfect. Like Lion King, I think I think everybody sort of has that one Disney movie that was the movie when they were a kid. I think for me it was probably Lion King or maybe Aladdin. It was Lion King and Aladdin.
Yeah, I'm with you.
And those movies were perfect. As it's like why I don't know why they had to go back and do the live action ones. I mean, I understand why they did it because they wanted to make money, but
Sure.
it's just the first ones are perfect.
Aladdin was pretty. I thought Aladdin was pretty good. I mean, Will Smith did an amazing job. I mean, Robin Williams to even touch that character of the genie and he acknowledges that. He said, like, apparently when he first got asked to do it, he's like, no, I'm not doing that. Like that, Robin Williams perfected that role. Like, I'm not touching that. And but then he put his own spin on it. He added, his musicality to that role, and he really owned it in a different way. Like, I thought he was an awesome genie.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then the Lion King, I know that.
Who was in the live action one? Who was in the Lion King?
So lot of the original voices were white actors, right? And so they had in the live action, they had a lot of African American actors, is my understanding, who did a lot of voiceovers. And so I think it just they made it more culturally authentic, I think, compared to before. But they did the animation; it was incredible, like so good.
Interesting.
That one though, I still did like the cartoon over, but the Aladdin one, I don't know.
Are you about to say that you think live action Aladdin is better than animated Aladdin?
I think it's up there for sure. I actually really enjoyed it. And I think because maybe it's just bias. I love Will Smith and I love Robin Williams, and I think they each did their own thing. But those two made Aladdin, right? Like both the animated and the live action.
For sure, in the animated.
And so that's why I kind of hold the two kind of equal. And then if you go back to the cartoon version of Aladdin, like there's a lot of misogyny in those, and as there is with some of the old Disney movies anyways. And so they address some of those things in the live action, whether it be Jasmine's character or whatnot. So not that I was necessarily like that, that's one of the reasons why I went to go see it, but I'm just saying it just has, it's better taste now, right? So
interesting. Okay, well, I'll have to check it out because that's a bold statement. That is a very bold statement.
I think you'll like it. I don't think you'll be disappointed. I think you'll like it. You just have to have an open mind that it's not Robin Williams, it's not the animated, but Will does an awesome job.
Yeah. All right, so I have 2 points to make. Did you know that Will Smith turned down a role in a leading role in The Matrix?
I heard about that.
So they approached Will Smith to be Neo, which is Keanu Reeves' character, right?
Yeah.
And he turned it down to do Wild Wild West.
Yeah. Wild West.
I mean, and like he makes fun of himself, as he should. That's an awful decision. But I wonder and I've also really admired Will Smith. I love those Bad Boys movies, and he was really good in like Pursuit of Happiness, and like he's done a lot of great things. He's done some not so great things too, but he's done a lot of great things. And even like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was a big part of my childhood. I used to love that show.
Yeah.
But he even says, he's like, if I had taken that role, that movie wouldn't be what it was. The casting that they ended up with was perfect. So that was super interesting. Second point, I just watched Good Will Hunting for the second time. I watched it the first time probably 15 years ago. That's probably Robin Williams' greatest role. He was so good in that movie. Man, that movie's good. And that was
I watched it once, and I do remember him being incredibly it was incredibly well done.
And that was like it's like Matt Damon and like Ben Affleck wrote that movie, and like that was their first.
They got joint Oscars on that, I think, on Good Will Hunting.
Yeah, and like that was their first thing that they did in Hollywood, I think, was that movie.
Yeah.
Nailed it. Insane.
Yeah.
Anyways, so there's your two nobodies at the movies chat, which we should do that more.
We should do that more. Will Smith, I do appreciate all his biopics that he's done, like the
Ali.
Like he just did that Ali, and then obviously Pursuit of Happiness, and then the one on the concussion.
I didn't see that one. Was
the one
it
on
good?
the concussions?
Yeah.
You haven't seen that one?
Well, because I know that I pay a lot of attention to that sphere.
That's why I'm surprised, I guess.
Well, no, because I know that story. I knew that story before they made a movie about it, just because I'd been following all the stuff that had been happening with CTE and all that stuff. So I haven't seen that. I probably should, but I sort of knew a lot about it before the movie came out, so I thought, I already know what it is.
Yeah, so maybe from that perspective, maybe it wouldn't have been so novel for you. For me, it was. Like, I didn't really follow that story at all, and but he did a great job at playing that the lead person there. And then the one recently, King, what is it called?
King Richard? Is it Richard?
King Richard,
it's about the Williams sisters,
I just saw
right?
it. Yes. Amazing.
Oh, you watched it?
I watched it. Yeah, Michelle and I went to the theaters, which was our first theater movie. We went there in November, and that was an experience just to go to the theaters. It was just odd, but you get to choose your own seat and everything like that, so you really felt safe. And there's only like 6 people in the theater, so it was nice to just have it to yourself. But King Richard, amazing. He said that Serena and Venus didn't want to endorse the movie until they actually saw it, like when it was completed. So he said that during the screening, he said it was one of the worst 2 hours of his life because he didn't know what the reaction was going to be. And by the end of the movie, they were just in tears and they loved it. And so, I mean, that speaks to how they said that he nailed the voice and all this kind of stuff. It sounds like though King, like Richard was very much kind of glorified in the movie. And that's the criticism of that. Like he kind of maybe wasn't a really great guy. But the story is still fantastic though.
Like, do they paint him as like a full human? Like, do they sort of lionize him a little bit? Like, is he flawed?
No, they show his flaws for sure. 100% they show his flaws. The criticism is that the Williams sisters were kind of his second family, and they don't really talk about his previous history, that he had this whole other family that he had fathered and didn't support, apparently. So if you read up on that, he wasn't a good father to his first family, and so that's the part that's left out, and maybe understandably so. But as far as him being a dad to the Williams sisters, it shows his flaws. It shows this really interesting moment that if it were to have happened, the course of that family would have been completely different. So there's these kind of movements that are really heart and gut wrenching. So if you haven't seen it, totally go and see it.
Yeah, no, that's I have a few movies that are on my docket that I'd like to see, and that's one of them for sure. I haven't been watching many movies lately, but I have a growing list. What was the movie? So before November, when you went back to the theaters, what was the movie that you saw in theaters last?
I think it was Aladdin.
Probably 20. Okay.
I think it was Aladdin. Right. Yeah, Aladdin it was The Lion King, because Aladdin and Lion King the live actions came out the same year, which I was really perplexed about, because if you remember those Disney movies, they always would release them one a year, right? Because it was so much build up for like the blockbuster Disney animated movie. And they decided to release Aladdin and Lion King in the same year, which I didn't understand, because those are 2 of the biggest Disney animated movies maybe of all time, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
And so to have the live action released in the same year was weird. So I'm pretty sure we saw Aladdin in like May, and then Lion King in the summer, and then I don't think we saw any movies after that. So
yeah, right, fair enough. Yeah, I was trying to think the other day what the last movie I saw in theater, because I haven't been to the theater since the pandemic started, which I love theaters. It's so fun going to movies. And I was trying to think. My dad and I went and saw. So my dad's a big Blade Runner fan. So him and I. So when Blade Runner 2049 came out, him and I went to my parents' house, which is about an hour away, and we watched the first Blade Runner with Harrison Ford from 80 something. And then we went to the theater and watched Blade Runner 2049. It was awesome. That movie is awesome. Both those movies are awesome. And it was like this super fun thing that my dad and I did. So that was super sweet. So that might have been it. Or we went and saw Knives Out, I think, with Daniel Craig, which maybe would have been around the same time. It was like a murder mystery. That was also great. Really good. But I miss it. I'm excited to go back to the theater. And I was going to go back to the theater to watch the new James Bond movie.
Right. Yeah.
I Love
You're
me
a
some
fan.
James Bond. Yeah. Well, and especially like Daniel Craig James Bond. He's the best James Bond there's ever. Well,
Is he?
sorry.
You think so?
Well, I do, but I haven't watched one of every James Bond, but yeah, I think he's the best. He's so good. Anyways, so I was going to go see that one, but I never got around to it. So, and then Dune would have been good too. Dune is like, because that's Denis Villeneuve, and he's all about like building these huge like soundscapes and like atmospheres and worlds, and he's been great at it. He's also Canadian, so that would have been a good one to see, but I didn't go see that either. Anyways, so
I wonder how movie theaters are gonna like do coming out of this pandemic, especially because like Amazon Prime and Netflix are like they like think about how much of an advantage they probably had in this space right now or this time, right? Like just because everyone's relying on them for content, that they're obviously creating their own movies. Those movies are not going to go in movie theaters, I don't think, right? So
they've started now though. Because like before, if you, like before, there was a lot of movie releases that were just straight to Netflix or like straight to a streaming service or whatever. Now a lot of the new movies that are coming out, they're releasing to theaters again, and then after theaters, then they're coming to a streaming service, or they'll be in theaters for like 2 weeks and then they'll come to streaming services. So I feel like they're really trying to, because I imagine that the movie studios make much more money through their box office than they would through whatever Netflix pays them. Yeah. So it seems like when I see a trailer, I'm like, oh, like this looks like an interesting movie. I'd like to see it. Where can I stream it? A lot of them now are only in theaters until X amount of time. So I wonder if that's starting to ramp up again.
I was thinking about those movies though that are produced and created by Netflix. So you think about like totally. Don't Look Up or what's the one that came out, the action one with The Rock that read something. Apparently Netflix spent the most amount of money on this movie. Like so they're like really producing and put a lot of money behind these movies, and they're largely successful. So if Netflix and Amazon continue to do that, does it eat up territory on those other studios who only have access to movie theaters, right? For sure. Especially if they're producing amazing content. So,
and it's so convenient to not go to the theater. Like I love the theater experience; it's great. But I also love, just farting in my sweatpants on my couch watching something, and then going to bed 2 minutes after it's over. Yeah. And also, paying $14 for the whole month as opposed to $40 for a movie. Yeah. No, there's a lot of arguments for streaming services for sure. And I worry about that too with just life in general coming out of the pandemic. Like, like going to a hockey game versus just watching it at home. And all the rigmarole now that it takes to like go to hockey games which is I haven't dealt with crowds. I haven't dealt with lines. I haven't dealt with anything. And I'm talking like the pandemic's over. It's not. It's in full swing. It's as bad as it's ever been. So I'm not going to get any more comfortable. But, if you think about, if we ever get to a place where we're all comfortable with COVID and a hockey game's an option, or I can just sit at home and watch it, I don't know. I wonder if I'll I wonder if I'm getting lazy. Like, I wonder if I'll just be like, it would be fun to be there, but I can watch it at home. I don't know. Like, I wonder how much that'll impact my willingness or my desire to be out and about amongst crowds, and just sort of that mental shift that it'll take to get back involved in what life used to look like, or whatever post-pandemic, however close it gets to what it used to look like.
Yeah, I'm sure that mental shift is gonna. It's probably gonna take some time for it to happen, but there's no like the experience of a live event is very different and very unique, and even though you don't have always the best view sometimes, and sometimes it's just better to watch things on screen. It's just nothing. We actually. My mother-in-law bought us tickets to go see the Harlem Globetrotters when they came to Edmonton 3 weeks ago. And so to be at Rogers Place here in Edmonton, to be in front of a live crowd, like here in Edmonton, we have the sort of the vaccine passports or where they check everyone's vaccine information. So you knew that everyone who went in there was vaccinated, so it makes you maybe feel a little bit comfortable. But still, with Omicron, you're still spreading it even if you have the vaccine, right? So just being in a large crowd, we're all sitting beside each other. There's probably 10,000 people in the building, right? It was our first event like that. You kind of felt a little nervous, but it was fun. It was nice to be amongst other people and to watch a live event. And it was, once we kind of got eased into it, it was enjoyable. So we're supposed to be going to an Oilers game, when my in-laws come at the end of the month. We're supposed to be going to the Oilers Canadiens game. So I don't know what that looks like. Hopefully that still happens, but that would be a prime game to go to for sure. So I'm excited to just experience those live events. I think for me, I'm kind of there. I'm tired. I'm done. I got my booster. I'm healthy myself, and it's always been for me really about my daughter, and just, I know generally kids have been okay, and even if they got COVID, you don't really hear tragic cases for the most part, but that's always been my fears because she was not vaccinated, and so yeah. But for me, I'm kind of ready to go.
Yeah, no, I get that for sure. I was looking at there's a couple bands that I've been really into the last year, and they're coming to town, and I really would love to see them. As my voice cracks, I would love to see them, but it would, they're like punk bands, so it's like a small venues that are, usually pretty packed, and you're shoulder to shoulder with folks or whatever, and but I really want to go because I think it'd be a fun show. But I sort of wrestle with, well, it's a risk, and is it a risk? And I'm the same as you. If I didn't have kids, I probably wouldn't be thinking twice about it because I'm vaccinated, I've been boosted, and so I feel pretty good about that. And I don't have any of the main comorbidities or any comorbidities that I am aware of that would impact my ability to sort of handle an infection. And stranger things have happened, but I feel pretty comfortable with that. But with kids, though, you're like, well, I don't want to bring it home. I don't want to put my kids through that and all that stuff. But part of me is just like, I also want to start living my life a little bit and see things that are exciting. And I think about too, like the last couple of years, it's been really hard. And I think about the memories, like we've canceled, like we would have tentative plans, and then somebody would have a runny nose or somebody wouldn't be feeling well or whatever it was. So we would cancel at the last minute. And we've done that, more in the last 2 years than we've ever done in our lives. And it was a responsible thing to do, and it was the prudent thing to do. And I don't regret it, but you think about, well, what would those memories have been like if we would have gone? And you sort of, I feel like we're sort of, stacking up or collecting, sort of lost opportunities for closeness with friendships. And I feel like some of my friendships have sort of suffered too, because we haven't been able to see people as much as we want. And, like these video chats are great that you can do on your phone or on your computer, but it's just not the same, right? And so I sort of worry about not being able to connect with friends. And if we, if there is a mental shift coming out of the pandemic and it impacts, like your willingness to go see friends and family, and your long-term relationships with those people that you love suffer, that sucks too. So it's sort of this balance, right? Like, it's safety of family, and that should be absolutely paramount, but it's also now starting to think about, well, with Omicron, it seems like this is maybe just something that we're going to be living with forever. And we got to start living our lives a little bit, but that's an easy thing for me to say. It's a tough thing for me to do. I don't know. It's a real weird mental space that I'm in right now with, dealing with the risk associated versus wanting to do interesting things and make memories with people I love again.
I think throughout this whole pandemic, the conversation's always been about risk reward, right? And for me, before the vaccine, it was always risky. It wasn't like to go and socialize and go and see people, to feel that reward. The risk far outweighed that. As I went through vaccines, that started to shift a little bit, but still the risk was still there. Now, I don't know. I think that I don't know if I could say that I'm suffering from loneliness, but certainly there's a element of that for sure for me. And there's the risk of I do pretty good self-care, so I wouldn't say like my mental health is like at a really low place. But I think the risks of all these things that you just spoke about now outweigh. If you were to say those are the rewards, they're starting to outweigh that risk now of catching COVID and having to deal with that. So for me, that balance is shifting, and I feel like it's shifting really quickly, and we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that from so many people, and And it's not just frustration on one element of the spectrum, whether your political ideologies are right or left. I think everyone's frustrated and we're all just kind of handling it in our own ways. But I think it's people are starting to get real tired of this. And we're seeing this, right? Like with this, convoy that we're seeing here in Canada, going across the country and going to different capitals and in the various provinces and Ottawa. I think the original element of that, the frustration maybe was warranted, and now it's kind of the message has probably been lost. And obviously the original intent was the freedoms piece and government entrenching on their freedoms to get vaccinated or not. But
yeah, I don't know that I know the sort of rationale behind it that well, and I don't think I understand it. Like free speech is good, and like the right to protest and all that stuff. That's those are part of being a democratic.
Fundamental, right?
Yeah, totally, right. Like I support democracy, and that needs to happen. But it almost feels like, because from what I understand, it was there are truck drivers who thank you, truck drivers, right? Like we'd be just so fucked without them. And they're hauling all our goods, and we'd be just in such a bad place without those transport services and the hard work they do. And so you hate to impinge on their ability to do things. But from what I understand is, so the federal government put in certain restrictions or mandates on truck drivers, requiring them that if they aren't vaccinated, that there'd be a 2-week quarantine period when they came back in the country from the United States or something. And so they put in some requirements around vaccinations. But from what I read, 90% of truckers that are crossing the border are already vaccinated. And so it's just a non-issue for them. And also there are similar requirements on the other side of the border. So this isn't a Canada-only thing. So, and I probably don't understand the issue 100%. So if all of that is true, so it's 10% of truckers who don't want to get, who don't want to get vaccinated, and sort of this infringes on their rights to infringes on their rights to to do that, to do their job. Okay, maybe there's a bit of a case there, but I also wonder. I have a buddy who he has a job where he is constantly procuring truck drivers and transportation services. And he said that the industry right now is so busy, particularly within Canada, that he can't find truck drivers. He can't find transportation services sometimes. And so that's an anecdotal piece, right? Like that's a single piece of evidence, or, it's a story. So it doesn't paint a whole picture, certainly. But, it sounds like there's no shortage of work to be had within Canada. And if 90% of truck drivers are vaccinated, and so if they're crossing the border, it's not an issue. I guess this almost feels like it was something that kind of came about for other people to sort of pile in on, and now it's really turned into this really weird and sort of unhealthy. Like today in Edmonton, there's reports of a farmer's market was attacked by a bunch of people that were supposedly and this is all on Reddit, so who knows if it's true, but somebody made a post that said, there's people in here and they're being belligerent at this farmer's market and they're smashing windows or whatever. Could just be hoopla. I'm not saying it happened, but there are similar cases of in Calgary, people were actively, so people who were part of the convoy were actively blocking AHS services related to ambulance stations and stuff. So that's not good. No, so it sort of turned into this really messy and really ugly thing that feels like that at the start of it, maybe there was a good intent, but now, and there was swastika flags at a couple of them. And just it feels like people have sort of piggybacked on this thing that maybe started as a, as a, and I'm not saying it was reasonable, but started as a coherent, at least, standpoint. And now it's just turned into this sort of piggyback thing that you could, this sounds sort of dismissive, but it just sort of makes you want to ignore it because you're like, well, I don't even know what this is about. 100%. And there's some things here that I really don't agree with. And that I some of these behaviors are terrible. And I don't know. So it's just really turned into a hot mess. And I don't know. So I'm so confused by the whole thing and I don't get it. And if there was a good message at the start of it, then it's completely lost in anything that's happened. And people aren't, I don't know. I've been interested in what you think about it, but I'm so lost in all of it.
No, I agree with you. I think that even if you were somebody who really tried to understand the message behind this convoy and why it got started, you can't really how do you do that at this point? Right?
Yeah.
You couldn't. Like, it's completely lost, as you said. There's all these other voices that are not offering, they're not productive, that are or now very extremist elements, as you described, or have entered that. And while those extremist elements may not represent the majority of those convoy, you can't have a proper conversation about it, right, with those extremist voices in place. I think going back, though, if we were just to focus on the original intent, if you're from the government standpoint, I could see, okay, so the risk of not having the mandatory vaccinations for truckers is that with anyone who isn't vaccinated, there is this potential of spreading the virus. And, if those truck drivers get sick, you now have issues clogging up hospitals. You now have truck drivers off the road. They can't deliver goods. So there's a huge risk on that. And so the reward is obviously the opposite. But I kind of wonder on the thing that the government is playing with, which I'm wondering if it's really necessary, is that it's one thing to have, I think, public sector employees require that mandatory vaccination, because we are, like, as public sector employees, you're if that's, if you require that vaccination, that's what you got to do. But to then actually have private citizens get the requirement to get vaccinated, I think the argument always, I think, is that slippery slope argument. And so if I was one of those truck drivers, or if I was thinking about individual freedoms, you first said that, okay, public sector employees have to get vaccinated. So now if you're following that slippery slope argument, it's like, okay, well, what next? Well, now we're starting to see what next, right? Is that it's now encroaching into private citizens. Okay, so why do that? Well, because we want to protect the country, want to ensure that there's not transmission across the border, that sort of thing. 90% of truck drivers have been vaccinated. Omicron is spreading regardless whether you're vaccinated or not. Is 10% of those truck drivers, are they actually going to cause a huge spike in Omicron cases? Omicron's here, right? So I think the logic doesn't necessarily hold entirely, which I think if you're trying to be purely logical about this, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I think there's a huge risk now, like, that you're now tampering with people's freedoms, right? Like, I get that part of it, like, just that element of the argument, right? I get that part. I guess, why people would be frustrated.
Yeah, and I always appreciate your ability to sort of see both sides of the argument. I'm not good. I'm not quite as good at that as you are, so I always appreciate that. And I guess the one thing I don't totally agree with is I think, yes, the main point of vaccinations, while we understand that you can transmit it with Omicron, I don't know that it's so much the transmission, but it's the severe outcomes that they want to avoid, because those severe outcomes take up hospital beds for people who maybe could need them, right? So you want to avoid those. So I think that's probably the main argument, because I think, we know, like, if you're vaccinated, you can still get Omicron. Absolutely, you can, and you can still pass it on. And so I think that the big thing there is just to sort of make sure that there are hospital beds available for people who need them with things that aren't avoidable. So I guess that's one point. And the other thing, I think that there needs to be a space to have questions about vaccinations and mRNA technologies and all those things. I think there has to be a space for it. And people need to feel that they can say, hey, I'm hearing some things about these vaccines, like elevated myocarditis rates in boys 12 to 19 or whatever it is. There was a paper that came out that said, if you get the vaccine, there's chances that, if you have a son who's in this age range, he has a higher chance of getting myocarditis than somebody who's outside of that age range with the vaccination. Now, if that age range gets COVID, they have a much higher risk of getting myocarditis. Like, that risk exceeds the vaccination risk. But I feel like that information isn't disseminated in a way that's like super accessible and super relatable, and can sort of be communicated to an audience with various backgrounds and various understandings of the subject matter. And so that sucks. And so I will agree that we need to be able to ask these questions and not be labeled in one camp or the other, right? Like, if I, generally speaking, me, I am fine with the vaccine, and I have it. As soon as my kids can get it, they'll get it. I am supportive of the vaccine, and so, but there's also folks who might have some questions who are also supportive of the vaccine, but they want to ask questions, and some groups of people might say, "Oh, well, you're asking questions about the vaccine, like you're an anti-vaxxer." And they're like, "No, I just have some questions about this. It's and so I would love to be able to ask them and get answers, but where do you get that information from?" And so that's like that space to have sort of those critical conversations around something for people that actually just want the information. I think we're in a time where you can't. It's difficult to have those kinds of conversations. And again, I'm all for the vaccine. But I just think that we need to have a space where we can have those conversations for people that are a little worried about it, or are like worried for their kids, or whatever. Even though that there might not be any reason to be worried, just a way to sort of communicate that effectively. And actually, there's this guy, Dr. John Campbell. He's got a wonderful YouTube page where he posts every day, and what the vast majority of his videos that I've seen are here is a study that was just released. Here is where you can access it. It is in this journal. Here's what the main points are. Here's how they determined that, and here's what the conclusion is. And maybe as a medical professional, because he's a doctor, I think he's in the UK, this is generally what that means to me. This is how I'm interpreting it. And here's here are some things that have been proven to help with, if you do get COVID, or here's why the vaccine's a good idea. Here's some things that are associated with it. And he's vaccinated, but he's really, really good at sort of taking these complex pieces of information, scientific, that follow scientific, peer-reviewed scientific procedures, and he just breaks it down so an idiot like me can understand it. And it's just super helpful, but that information source is not something that's like readily available.
He gets millions of views too, I think, right? I think
He's pretty
popular. I think he's become.
Is he? Okay, good. Yeah, then good, because he should be. Yeah. And he really, to me, an idiot, seems like this sort of unbiased source of really good information that seems to be pretty reliable. And I feel like everybody just watched a video like that or had a source like that they feel like they could trust. It would really help with that conversation, because and this happens everywhere. This polarization of ideas and tribes and whatever happens everywhere. And I'm guilty of it all the time. I'll write off somebody's opinion because they associate themselves with something, and that's not a healthy thing to do. I mean, in certain circumstances, sure, but so I've been really trying to work on that, and I find that these vaccination conversations sort of fall into that same thing.
So two thoughts. First, in the time that I've gotten to know you and we have conversations, I always feel like you try to understand whether it be my perspective or other people's perspective and try to balance that with everything. So it's interesting to hear you say that you would discount people or kind of the way you described it. So that's I just haven't necessarily seen that all the time. So it's interesting you say that. The second piece, though, is with any technology, there's always an adoption curve. There's always, you have early adopters and it's a small percentage. I think it's only like 16% or whatever that are early adopters. And then you start to have this exponential growth of adopters and you kind of hit a peak. You think about like this vaccine, that time window from like early adoption to like the peak has been so smushed in terms of the amount of time that we've had to adopt this technology.
But the technology is not new, right?
The technology is not new, but what I'm saying, just like I can appreciate, just going back to your point about people wanting to ask questions about the vaccine.
Sure.
With anything new that comes and people haven't had a chance to really think about this, usually there's time to kind of to suss that out. And I get it. I want people to get vaccinated. I encourage people to do that. But I have a spot in my mind where I have a lot of empathy for people who are asking these questions and who are wanting to take their time and do what's right for themselves, right? And I think that we need to have constructive conversations about vaccinations, about how they're safe, and continue having these conversations and showing the data rather than having rather than having really forceful, aggressive conversations with people why they need to get vaccinated, which I think that's where, it's going, where people feel forced that they have to do it, rather than just encouraging people and making them aware that, this is one of the most studied medicines on the planet, maybe in all of history. And all the data is showing really, really positive things, right? And that's the kind of message that we should be communicating, rather than pigeonholing people into like, okay, if you're not getting the vaccination, you're the problem, right? Like, it just doesn't help. It doesn't putting people's backs up against the walls and saying that you're the problem, I don't think helps anything.
Yeah.
Right?
The thing is, though,
really don't. People don't want to be the problem or the cause for.
Some people do,
illness.
though. That's
sure.
We're
not talking. I'm not talking about those people. We're talking about the people who are seriously thinking about these things. Yeah. And I suspect that's the majority of the people who are maybe haven't got vaccinated. Of course, those extreme voices always drown out the more sensical ones because they're loud and sometimes obnoxious,
like
right?
CNN and Fox News and
yeah.
What a problem that is, right? Like, you can't, because you're right, because there are people who, in good faith, who actually just want to learn, to support their decisions. They're not following any agenda. They just want, how do I access this information? And even if you access the peer-reviewed articles, even if you can, Google it and come across it, I don't understand half that language. I don't know what it's saying, and so just that's whole dissemination of good information, factual information that's been peer-reviewed, understanding the peer-reviewed process and why you need to, why that is paramount, why that is, I don't know. It's just, and I'm lucky because I was able to get a BSc, so I have a degree. I took all these courses. It was drilled into me that this is why this is good. Here's how it works, and it's not some voodoo. It's not it's just hey, I have a hypothesis. I want to test it. Here's exactly how I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do that within this scientific community. Yeah, okay, let's do all these experiments. Yeah, we did. Great. Sounds good. Here's our conclusion. Put that out in the world. Have all the other scientists who care about this read it and then critique it. It's just like this. And that's a really stupid way of describing the process. But in general, it's not like this sort of magic voodoo system. It's a pretty straightforward, in a basic way, and it's a wonderful methodology, and sure it has flaws, but just understanding that's important, understanding where you can get it, but then also being able to have somebody communicate it to you clearly in common language is important, and that's just a real that doesn't exist in super accessible media sources right now. It just doesn't. I don't think, unless somewhere. But that's what this John Campbell guy does. It's just so important to have those sources.
I agree with you. And although the other thing that compounds this problem is that even if you have these sources, trust in these sources and trust in our institutions is feels like at an all-time low. Mm-hmm. So even whether it be our government institutions, forget about it. It seems like governments have an uphill battle at trying to communicate what is the truth and what's not the truth, because people are losing faith in government and these kind of traditional institutions. And now we can't even have a basic discussion on the basic facts of science, anymore. And so science is, as an institution, if you were to even call it an institution, is losing trust within society. How do you even have conversation? This is my biggest concern out of all of this, is that we as a society are losing faith in the things that we used to hold so dearly as sources of truth. And while there's still sources of truth, you and I work in the public sector, when we know we all try to work towards the source of truth and do our job in an honorable way, doesn't mean that the rest of society views our role or views government in the same way as it used to. And this is my biggest concern is the faith we have in our democratic institutions and now in science, climate change, for instance. We're arguing, it's one thing to argue about having those debates, those scientific debates, but if we can't even come to a basic common understanding or agreement on the basic scientific facts, we have a problem in our society. This is what keeps me up at night, and these are things that concern me for sure.
Yeah, and I wonder if
that's the bigger problem in all this to me.
And I haven't looked at any data on this or anything. I wonder if we're actually living in a time where like the faith in science is actually at an all-time high. Like the percent of the population that like actually believes in like the scientific process, and like peer-reviewed science and like good science is actually at an all-time high. But because of the internet and social media, and because of how TV coverage is now sort of played out, how both sides, if it's like with climate change, like 98% of all climate scientists in the world say, yep, without a doubt, this is a thing that's happening. But there's 2% who say, nope, it's not happening. But they get equal airtime. And so, and like that happens with a lot of issues, because that's how you get views. Like you want the sort of hot, topic. You want the, these clickbait headlines. You want, Bill O'Reilly yelling at somebody as loud as he can. And that's what gets it. And so I wonder, I just, and you and I have talked about Steven Pinker before, but his book, Enlightenment Now, really is just, he says, it just really shows you that like this is the greatest time to be alive, and here's all these reasons why, and here's here's sort of what the anecdotal narrative is around these things, but it's all bullshit, because like, and then he just has like 400 pages of data that says, it's a pretty good time to be alive right now because of just about every way that you could possibly measure it. And so I wonder if it's one of those things where like you and I are both worried about it when it's not really a problem, but the Facebooks of the world and the CNNs and the Fox Newses and the whatever just play on this debate like it's an actual debate, when in reality, for the vast majority of the population, it is not a debate. Maybe.
It's a really, really great point. No, I think it's a really, really great point. And I was thinking about that as you were saying that, because, these louder voices drown things out, but how is it actually having an effect on people's psyche and their behavior? I don't know. And that's where the data really comes into play. I mean, if you think about our province or even our country in terms of vaccination rates, we're pretty high up there in terms of overall vaccination rates. Yet these loud voices suggest that maybe if you were to just listen to those loud voices and think, oh man, Canada's vaccination rate is probably pretty low. Actually, it's not, right? And so you kind of wonder, are those voices or are these outlets that you speak of, maybe they're not really having an effect, but it's just not productive and constructive, but then you also don't want to undermine it too, right? Because you see what happened with the former president and his movement and this whole big lie thing, and he has a loud voice, and he obviously has so many backers supporting it, and it is shifting. It's shifting politics in a huge way in the United States. Like I thought that maybe this was like after he was done and he continues this big lie, that at some point, people will just get over it. But no, Republican state legislatures are changing laws to impact voting rights and all kinds of stuff because of that election. Like it's serious, like institutional changes are happening because of some really loud voices. So I kind of balance these two things about like, okay, maybe it's not really making a difference, and you can probably have some evidence to suggest that these loud voices are actually not really having a difference on the majority of people. But then you see these cases like what I just described, and it actually is resulting in like Did you hear about what the Republican Party just said about the January 6th attack on the Capitol?
No.
They said it was normal political discourse. The Republican Party said that this was normal political discourse.
Wasn't like somebody shot and killed? It's
outstanding that like a whole party, just like the leading American party, would say this about attack on their capital. This is normal political
breaking and
discourse.
entering, right? Like, and like people were shot and somebody died, and like just this is normal. Like this is I don't know. I also just read a book. It's called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by a guy named, I think Timothy Snyder was his name. And it's basically just like people have faith in democratic institutions and the permanence of democratic institutions, but history has shown that there's no such thing as a permanent democratic institution. Mm-hmm. And any democratic institution can be overthrown and lost to some dictator or to a tyrant or whatever it is. And so he kind of works through, some examples in history of when that happened, and he focuses a lot on like Germany in the 30s, right? But sort of scared me a little bit because and he makes these linkages. He's like, here's the thing that happened with the last president. Here's the thing that happened in 1930 Germany. And I don't want to like make those, that's I'm not saying that he was a Nazi, that like Trump was a Nazi. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is like I'm also not saying that he doesn't, he might have some characteristics that are also found in white supremacists. But what I am saying is like this guy wrote this book and he was just like, here's some things that happened and here's some things that happened. And there's some linkages here between these things. And like, I don't know, it just also makes you think that like we probably shouldn't be taking democracy for granted, and we probably shouldn't be, treating these things lightly because, countries in the past have treated things like this lightly and it didn't end up well for them. And so he sort of, so I've just made that statement about Steven Pinker and how good his book made me feel. This other book sort of had me worried a little bit. But just like, it's not, like there is no, like look at, I don't know, there is no government that is absolutely impenetrable, or that is absolutely what's the word I'm thinking of, that like cannot be undone and cannot be overcome and cannot be overtaken or changed or swayed in some.
They're talking about like
way.
A democratically elected government.
Yeah. Like there's a ton of
obviously
examples.
There's authoritarian governments that probably nothing's going to change, but
they do though. Like that's the thing. Like sometimes things change, and I'm not like. Anyways, I don't know enough about this to be speaking, to other people about it, but no government is permanent, and no government is impervious to change or to revolution or to whatever it is. And it's not like one day, it just happens. It's not just like one day, it's these slow builds up. It's that whole like, frog in a pot of water sort of thing where it just slowly gets hotter and the frog's dead. Anyways, and so this guy makes these linkages between like, sort of like peaceful countries that turn to not peaceful very slowly through small acts and all this stuff.
Well, we're seeing that. I don't know if you've been tracking anything in Eastern Europe. I mean, you were seeing those kind of changes. Like, I don't know if it's right-wing extremism that's kind of creeping up, but certain elements of that, because it's been happening over a slow amount of time. People are not liking these changes, and now, governments are getting toppled, and you're seeing a big shift in governments. I mean, governments should always be the case that governments are never this sort of static entity that's impenetrable, right? Like the government should ebb and flow and adapt to changing society and the will of their people. I think governments who fail to do that are the ones that probably get toppled eventually. I think if those governments that are adaptive and understand citizens' needs and take them seriously, all voices are probably more likely to succeed. And so I'd be curious to hear Steven Pinker's thoughts on if that book touches on democracy in any case, and how he views that, and how he explained the evidence behind trends and all that kind of stuff, and his views overall on that. But I think as soon as democratically elected governments in particular, but any government doesn't quite hear the voices of their people or chooses not to, it becomes a problem. And that problem, like you said, might not surface right away, and it will surface, and eventually it surfaces in a really aggressive way. And so even this Trucker Convoy thing, while it might not represent the majority of voices of Canadians, which I'm sure it doesn't, if you're the Prime Minister, I think that you still want to hear these voices, especially the core element of those voices, because there's something there. There's something that's pissing a lot of people off. And whether you agree with it or not, as soon as you discount those voices, as we talked about in the past, that's when some big changes can happen. And that's when governments are not really being reflective of the democratic will of the people. So
what do you do to voices that aren't worth listening to? Like that's
No, I know that. Well, like I said, I think those voices that have clouded the original intent or the movement or whatever, I don't think they deserve to necessarily be heard, because their agendas are not necessarily probably the same agenda as if you just focus on the truckers, right? But I think now it's become so big of a thing that if the prime minister went to go and address this, it's, it's done with at this point, right?
So
like there's
messy, yeah.
It's so messy, right? But I think in the beginning, if there could have been, I don't know. I obviously I'm not in that position. Don't know the behind the scenes, but I guess just broadly speaking, I think that sometimes, it's the same thing when they talked about the 2016 election, right? The Democrats pretty much ignored the Rust Belt states because they thought it was fully in their bag, right? That they would always be Democratic states. Wisconsin, Michigan, all those states would always be there. As Pennsylvania. 2016 happened. Trump went in there. He spoke to them. He heard their concerns. He spoke the words that they wanted to hear, and those some of those were people who voted for Obama in both of those two terms, and they switched to Trump because they felt that they were being heard and that the Democrats kind of just glanced over them.
Yeah,
right?
I actually. It might have been from you that one of the most common traits among Trump voters was that they felt that they were finally being heard or that they weren't being heard from previous administrations. Which, I mean, you got to listen to that. Like that's if your voters aren't feeling heard and it causes them to vote for the other party, which in the States, like, it has to be a pretty dramatic shift. That's worth listening to, certainly.
Well, Obama, I think, spoke those people who voted for Obama twice and then voted for Trump, they felt like Obama was speaking to their cause and blue collar workers and ensuring that Obama understood the problem and that they were losing their jobs overseas, all these kind of things. And it didn't seem like the Clinton campaign or just at that time that the Democrats were taking those voices seriously because they thought that there's no way they could lose those states. There's no way. And Trump went in there and surprised everybody, and whether he delivered on that or not is a discussion point, I suppose. But they got some of those votes back clearly for Biden to win. But I guess again, just goes back to I never take any of those voices for granted, whether you agree with them or not. I think especially if you're democratically elected, but even authoritarian governments, I kind of wonder about how long they're going to be able to hold at some point, especially in this day and age when information is traveling. And then you think about and I still haven't wrapped my head around this, and I know we've talked about this briefly, but if we go into this Web 3.0 and governments don't have very much control over, blockchain networks, and people are able to communicate a lot more freely without any government oversight, what is that going to do for authoritarian countries, right?
So exciting. Man, blockchain gets me all amped up. I don't know. I'm like the annoying guy who likes to talk about it because it's so interesting. I don't know. And I'm not that well versed in it, but just as a concept, it's incredibly interesting. And I think it's I think it's so, and I'm an idiot again, I always say this, but I think it's so obviously the future. Like if you look at, so Google has massive warehouses full of servers storing all of our data that we just give them for free. We give it to them for free. Mm-hmm. And they use it to make billions and billions, trillions of dollars probably. And all of that infrastructure, they have a warehouse full of servers in Oregon, I think, and they put it there because there was an old dam from some previous industrial facility that was there. And this facility requires so much electricity and energy to cool it down and to power it that it has its own fucking dam. And it's a huge security breach because all of that information is in one center. And I'm not saying that Google doesn't have its firewalls up to date, or it's they probably pay for the Avast, anti-malware systems. They obviously have amazing world-class security systems, right? But it's a massive risk. Where then you go to blockchain, there is no central server, there is no ability to hack that information, or there has yet to be one. In order to disrupt one single aspect of those blockchains, you need to be able to reiterate every single block that comes after the one that you want to change. And it's just it's insane that it's all decentralized. It cannot be regulated by a single body. It does have weaknesses here and there, But with every iteration, every blockchain that comes out, every new altcoin that comes out, it's all people trying to improve on this original Bitcoin blockchain. So like Ethereum, you can do your apps and, there's smart contracts capabilities, and all these other ones are like building off of that. And I don't know, I think it's so obviously the future. And you wonder, like, in the long term, because I had also just read this thing that said in the future, and like you can do it now, like you can download a browser to your computer that you tell it exactly when to share your information and to who. And in certain capacities, you can actually earn certain like kinds of points and things. Like I don't know if it exists now where you can actually earn money on your data, but there are programs now that allow you to determine who you're going to give your data to and when and how you're going to be compensated for it. And that, like, that's on these blockchain networks, you mean? It's well, there's certain browsers. Like right now, like you can go and download.
Like the Brave browser.
Brave browser, totally. So all I'm saying is, like, it seems, based on the very limited research that I've done, that it seems like we're getting away from that centralized information storage warehouse that's used to make companies just insane amounts of money that we give away for free, that like requires all these resources, versus something like the blockchain where it's the exact opposite of all of that. And so as we move away from that sort of centralized information, that like there's also a movement now for us to be a little bit more in control of our information and our data and how it's used. And we now understand that actually our preferences, our data, our activities and our habits online, that's actually it's a form of commodity that, like, we can be compensated for, because companies make a ton of money. Like, they want to know what we're doing so they can influence a bunch of other things on the internet. And so it seems like there's this massive shift away from it. Anyways, that's a long rambling thing, and this is what happens when I get talking about this stuff, because it's so interesting. But like, that's a massive shift away, and like, this is all decentralized. And so what does that mean? Like how does that fit into all of this moving forward?
100%. I wonder about the threats, though, to to decentralized blockchains or this movement towards Web 3.0. One, and the obvious, is just how are governments going to react to this? What is their approach going to be? I mean, the Securities Commission in the United States has already indicated that they're looking to propose some regulations or something on the whole crypto scene and blockchain networks. So we don't know what that's going to look like. So that's obviously one big threat. The other piece is, no question, the amount of energy that's still needed to mine and develop blockchain networks is massive. And so until we make a shift to renewables and clean sources, it's a threat that's still, especially in parts of Asia where Bitcoin mining is happening, or mining of any kind of coins is happening. Still largely the energy sources are dirty sources. So that's another threat.
Yeah,
and then the other threat that I think that I wonder about is, right now Web 3.0 and blockchain networks the idea is very positive. And with anything that's being created, like social media, Facebook, all these social media apps, originally the Silicon Valley was there to create something positive, and everything goes to shit afterwards. And my concern with blockchain networks is, obviously, if it's decentralized, is whose hands does it get into? And you might not be able to track, obviously. I don't know. This is something maybe you have a better thought on, a better understanding of this, but like, how do you track, terrorist activities or criminal activity, or just people who use it for the worst of the worst things you could do in society or in life?
Yeah. Well, and
if those things really creep into blockchain networks, I think that will put a lot of pressure on, like, okay, what does this look like going forward? So, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I will agree with like ransomware attacks, where people like go into police station records and they freeze those records and they say, hey, you need to pay us X amount of Bitcoin, or we're going to erase all of your records. And like, these ransomware attacks are so sophisticated that entire governments, entire police forces, entire, like, these massive institutions just end up paying the ransom. because they can't figure out how to protect their security or their files or whatever it is against these ransomware attacks. Oftentimes, those ransomware attacks, they want to be, or the people who are administering those ransomware attacks want to be paid in some form of cryptocurrency because of the fact that it's almost impossible to trace, right? And so it has its issues from that standpoint, 100%. Also, now, from what I understand, what's happening is like people who are awarded the mining capabilities for additional blocks on any blockchain, you're more likely to be rewarded because you have to basically solve an algorithm or an equation to be awarded that. Like you're basically proving up these equations, right? And the first computer to do that, from what I understand, is the one who's awarded sort of that mining capability and the fraction of whatever the altcoin is that they're paid in order to kind of prove up those transactions. But so what happens is there's entire massive centers now, particularly that are focused 100% on just mining, and it's not a guy who was interested in this stuff 15 years ago or 10 years ago with a computer in his basement that's dedicated to mining. It's massive centers full of servers that are all they do is mining. And so those guys are out competing sort of the smaller resource hobbyists or whatever. So it's even gotten to the point where like people, and I think that maybe that's specific to Bitcoin. I don't know about the other ones. It's probably happening with those too, but the thing that I read was speaking about Bitcoin. It's already happening where people are finding ways a little bit to sort of chip away at this decentralized open source programs by throwing a bunch of money at this problem and sort of creating these mining centers, and so they're sort of already getting around, I think, what the original intent was. When the Bitcoin white paper came out, and who's the guy who invented Bitcoin? Nobody knows who he is, but his name is like Satoshi Nakamoto.
Japanese.
Yeah. Anyways, like he had this intent and like this vision, right? And people are already taking advantage of it and like turning it into an industry when that probably was never the intent of it. So, and how do you regulate it? I have no idea. I mean, I know when you buy cryptocurrency in Canada, you have to prove that you are you. So the government is aware that you are buying it, right? Like you can't, like you have to provide information. Some, like depending on the platform you use, like if you're using Coinbase or something, I think you have to actually send, like you need to prove that you are you by taking a picture of your driver's license. And then they confirm that it's you, right? So you're on record that like this account is tied to you, and now you have purchased and owned these altcoins or these coins, and so that's Canada. I don't know what the States does or other countries do, but the government is fully aware that I own altcoins, and so I guess there's a way of doing it. Like you just make sure. But the thing is, I can take those coins. I can put them on a cold wallet that's not connected to anything, and I can do whatever I want with them. And the government has no idea that I'm doing that. So it's not perfect, but if you're going to buy them, the government is aware that you've bought them. And so maybe that's a sort of way to do it. But that also chips away at sort of the anonymity that sort of goes along with these altcoins too. So I don't know. And I'm so intrigued as to where this is going to go in 15 years. Is it all just going to go away, or if Bitcoin's going to be worth $1 million in 20 years, or if it'll be this thing where like, man, remember blockchain? Like what?
Well, people are already having that conversation right now. They're like, you hear so many people are like, oh, if I would have invested $100 into Bitcoin, that would have been. Pretty well. I have some friends. This is a classic friend of a friend story, but they're like the two smartest people I know. I worked for one of them for a while, and her partner is this genius, and they're both just brilliant humans. Anyways, I was talking to them a while ago when I was working for one of them. I was talking to them, and he was explaining to me about, and like this is probably 12 years ago, and he's explaining to me about like Bitcoin and how his buddy has like this computer set up in the corner of his basement, and he's mining Bitcoin. I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I saw him a couple years later, and he's like, yeah, that guy doesn't have to work anymore. Because he and this is when Bitcoin was at $18,000. So it like went up to 18 and then it kind of dropped down, then it went up again.
Now it's at 45 or 50, whatever it is.
50 something thousand.
They're just like, yeah, he had like whatever it was, 500 Bitcoin, and he just doesn't have to work anymore. Like he
500? No.
Yeah. Well,
really?
Well, because if you just because he's just like an early adapter. Man, the first Bitcoin transaction ever, somebody sold 10,000 Bitcoin for 2 pizzas. So that's like it was like when it first came out, it was just this real niche thing that people were like sort of into, and oh, this is fun. I'll mine for Bitcoin. Oh, look at me, I have 1,000 Bitcoin, because it maxes out at what, like 45 million Bitcoin or something.
Yeah, there's a cap somewhere. I don't know what.
Anyways, so this guy had hundreds of Bitcoin. He just doesn't have to work anymore, just because he was like interested in this stuff 12 years ago or whatever it was.
Because what was that, like $25 million?
It's what
500 times $50,000 of Bitcoin.
So
was that?
So 5 times 5 is 25, and then add 2 zeros on the end of it. So if it's 50,000, so 1 zero is 500,000. Another 0 is 5 million times 5. That's 25 million, right? Yeah. Just a cool 25 million. And whatever. It was a lot of Bitcoin. There's 100 or 500. I can't remember, but it was enough to make you go. Mm-hmm. But now people even people who would have bought Ethereum when it was 25 cents, or if you had bought Solana this time last year, it's like, what is it now, 140 or something, like.
Yeah.
So and now like everybody's whatever, like you're going to buy Cardano, or you're going to buy what's the other one, the bank transaction one, doesn't matter. But like that's what it's become. People just buying a bunch of new coins that have a bit of potential, and hopefully it like takes off.
So one question on this. I always thought with the blockchain network, while it's the security the reason why it's so secure is because part of it is the encryption, and that like the way blocks are built off of each other and all that kind of stuff. But I thought that there's some sort of ledger. Like if you purchase, Bitcoin or one of these coins, there's a ledger. Who clearly, like, because you would have had that there's a validation that happens, right, through the network, through the blockchain network when a transaction occurs. And so there's a clear, like, marker of your involvement on that blockchain. So is that not true? And if that's true, then like, wouldn't that help? Like, doesn't that go against perhaps the tracking of criminal activity, because then you would know there's an imprint of somebody on the blockchain?
So I'm going to mess this up. If anybody's interested in this, MIT has a free blockchain course that you can audit online. So watch that and trust what that thing says. And I've watched a couple of videos. From what I understand, when you make a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain, I'm not sure about the other ones, there is a public key and a private key. And so basically when you send the transaction, so I buy some from you, let's just say, and you say, yeah, I want to send Kyle, whatever, 1/1000th of a Bitcoin. The ledger registers the transaction, and it says, I'm sending this from Rupesh, who you have a private key that nobody knows. And like a key is a code, just like it's, whatever. It's
encrypted code.
Totally, yeah. So, but like just think of it as like numbers and letters. So there's a private key and there's a public key. The public key is what goes on the ledger. But you need the private key to complete that transaction, and nobody can see that private key. And the private key proves that you are you, basically. And so you have one and I have one. And so you would say in the ledger, and it all goes through, there's a name for it, but it like goes through this machine that like, that constantly changes these numbers, and like it compresses all the transactions down into like smaller numbers. But to get there, you take these massive numbers and then kind of whittle them down through these transactions, right? So you have these private keys and public keys. On the ledger, the public keys are registered. So it can say it went from this public key to that public key. In order for that transaction to go through, though, you need to have your private key that matches that public key. But nobody knows what that private key is other than you. You're the only person who knows what that private key is. So the public key helps keeps the transaction or helps register the transaction on the Bitcoin registry, which from what I understand, anybody can go and download. Like it's actually a pretty small file because it's just all 0 and 1s and shit. So there are all kinds of computers all over the world who actually have the full Bitcoin blockchain key. Anyways, so I get the transaction. I prove it's me with my private key. And based on the algorithm between the public and private key, it's like, boop, 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 here's the public key. Yep, it matches the private key. That transaction goes through. But all it's proving is that it's going from this public key to that public key. But
nobody knows who owns that key.
Yeah, but the only person who can actually prove that transaction is theirs is with the private key. But those numbers don't mean anything to a government. Like, it's not like it says Rupesh Patel sold Kyle Vaughn these things.
Okay.
It's just like two numbers basically, and through these algorithms and transactions, they can prove that they match, but the numbers don't mean anything to anybody. My private key, I only know it. The government doesn't know what my private key is, and the public
There's
key.
no personal identifier attached to any of this.
Not from what I understand. No, and again, people should go watch the MIT thing because that guy it's super interesting, and he explains it in great detail, and he'll be able to sort of tell you. But so it helps it track it on the ledger, but it doesn't prove who you are. And like you can like with a cold wallet, you can like take your coins, put it on a cold wallet. That's disconnected from everything. So it's actually just like a little USB stick, but it's not. It's like a super small computer, but it looks like a little USB stick. And you can disconnect that from everything. And people like you could actually go in person and buy Bitcoin from somebody if you both had cold wallets, and you could just do that transaction, and the Bitcoin ledger would like register that transaction, but there's no Kyle Vaughn or Rupesh Patel there. It's just public keys and private keys, and that doesn't mean anything to a government.
Interesting.
From what I understand,
Okay.
and again, people should watch the MIT course because I'm very likely lying. But,
no, I mean, that was a pretty thorough answer, so I'm sure there's a lot of truth to what you're saying.
Who knows?
Very interesting. No, this is a fascinating conversation.
Now, what time is it? Should we be wrapping this up? Oh, it's 10 o'clock.
Yeah, I think so. That was a good chat. Yeah, we were kind of all over the place with fascinating topics, and the blockchain stuff I'm definitely interested. I want to find somebody who we can talk to, and what I want to understand is sort of the vastness of Web 3.0 and why this is transformational. What are the potential impacts of this and all that I have no idea about, and I'm starting to do some reading on this, but I would love to talk to somebody.
Yeah, I wonder who we could track down. We'll have to do some hard thinking on that one. Get the experts in. Yeah, buddy. Well, hey, thanks for the conversation. Always fun. These are my favorite episodes. The one where we don't have anything to talk about and we just go in and basically it's just us catching up. And then we let people in on, or folks on the internet in on the conversation. So appreciate it. I appreciate you, and let's do this again soon.
Yeah, appreciate you tuning in. Take care.